Night fell slowly, as if time itself hesitated to let her face what was to come. On television, the news echoed his usual routine, reports about the city, the weather, and small incidents that rarely caught his attention. But that night, something in the presenter's voice made her stop. It wasn't the content. After all, storms were nothing new in the region. It was the tone. There was an unusual weight to her words, as if she wanted to warn not just about the weather, but about something else. The presenter pointed to a map that showed the storm approaching. Lightning and strong winds forecast for the entire region, he said, with an almost theatrical seriousness. From the outside, the sky seemed to respond to these words. Dense, dark clouds accumulated rapidly, covering the stars like a curtain of black velvet. The wind began to blow harder, bringing with it a smell of wet earth and dry leaves. She got up from the couch, turning off the TV with a slight click, and went to the kitchen to feed her faithful companion, Nicholson. The cat, which always accompanied her like a silent shadow, seemed restless that night. His yellow eyes shone brighter than usual, reflecting the dim light of the kitchen. As he poured the food into his pot, he noticed that Nicholson did not approach immediately, something rare. He would stand still, as if he was listening to something she couldn't hear. "Come on, kid. Are you hungry or not?" Her voice sounded almost like a whisper, echoing lightly through the room. Finally, Nicholson approached, but his movements were cautious, as if the simple act of eating was a dangerous distraction. She laughed softly to herself, thinking she was exaggerating. It must be the storm. He went upstairs, adjusting 2 blankets on the bed. The wind was beginning to howl through the cracks in the windows, and the thought of curling up and listening to the sound of the rain seemed tempting. But there was something more to that night. A discomfort she couldn't name, a feeling that settled in her chest like a heavy stone. The newspaper presenter continued to echo in his mind. A storm is approaching. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she was referring only to time. And before continuing, leave your like, write yourself on the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories. The dawn arrived loaded with absolute silence, broken only by the first raindrops gently hitting the roof. For many, this sound would be relaxing, almost hypnotic, an invitation to peaceful sleep. But that night, there was something different. The irregular rhythm of the rain seemed more like a warning, a harbinger of something unsettling, something she couldn't name. It was this discomfort that made her suddenly wake up to the sound of scratching. At first, still stuck in the confusion of sleep, she thought it was just the wind whispering through the cracks in the window. However, as the noises became more insistent, she realized, with a knot in her stomach, that they were coming from inside the room. Nicholson. The cat was on the windowsill, his fur bristling like a wire brush and his eyes wide, fixed on something she couldn't see outside. His movements were frozen, but there was tension throughout his body, as if he was ready to attack or flee at any moment. Every muscle seemed on the verge of collapse or a burst of pent-up energy. "Nicholson, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice still choked with sleep and a hint of growing unease. He did not answer. There wasn't even that quick glance in her direction, as she used to do whenever she wanted attention or food. He was hypnotized, completely absorbed by something out there. It was as if the world around him had disappeared. She felt a shiver slowly rise down her spine, but she still got up and went to him. The movement was enough to trigger an instinctive reaction in the cat. He jumped from the parapet with impressive agility and ran to the door of the room. There, he began to scratch the wood with an almost desperate urgency. The sounds were harsh, insistent, as he meowed in a different way, almost a wail or a muffled scream. It was clear that he wanted to leave. No, he needed to leave. But where to leave? And why? She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The shiver down his spine was now almost a constant tingling, an uncomfortable sensation that made his breathing shallow. As he opened the door, Nicholson shot down the hallway like lightning, running down the stairs and running straight to the front door. She followed him automatically, her bare feet barely noticing the chill of the floor as her mind tried to process what was happening. When he reached the door, he saw the cat scratching even more vigorously, emitting a sound that seemed like a mixture of supplication and despair. It was a meow she had never heard before, something primal, which made her heart race in a strange way. He was desperate, as if something terrible was outside, or maybe something even worse was inside the house. Reluctantly, his fingers trembled as he turned the key and opened the door. The cold wind that came in hit her like a slap, carrying with it a strange smell, something metallic and damp, like oxidized iron mixed with wet earth. It was an odor she didn't recognize, but it caused a visceral, almost nauseating reaction. Nicholson shot into the darkness as soon as the crack in the door was large enough for him to get through. He didn't look back, he didn't hesitate. It was as if something irresistible was pulling him. She stood there, with the door ajar, staring at the empty yard in front of her. The rain continued to fall, now more intense, forming small puddles that shone in the dim light of the balcony. It was then that he perceived, with an almost painful clarity, his fear. It was not a common fear, one of those that come and go. It was something deeper, a visceral sensation that clung to the chest and made breathing difficult. She didn't know exactly what, but there was something different about that night. Something profoundly wrong. Back in the kitchen, she tried to regain some control over herself. His heart was still beating fast, and his thoughts were spinning in circles. She decided to stick to a little routine to calm her mind. He took a saucepan, heated the milk, and added generous spoonfuls of chocolate powder, stirring slowly until the liquid became uniform and thick. The sweet and familiar aroma filled the air, bringing a fleeting sense of comfort. This was his favorite drink for chilly nights, a ritual that used to bring tranquility. For a moment, he almost managed to forget what had happened. Steam rose from the cup in gentle spirals, wrapping around her face like a warm caress. But the relief was brief. Too brief. As he walked down the hallway with the cup in his hands, towards the bedroom, something caught his attention. She walked through the door that led to the basement and stopped suddenly, her feet fixed on the floor as if something invisible held her in place. A faint light escaped through the lower crack of the door. His entire body stiffened. That door was never open. It was a simple rule, a habit that she followed automatically, without having to think. Always closed, always locked. And the light. There was no reason for it to be lit. It was not possible. For a moment, she tried to rationalize. Maybe he had left it on by accident. But this explanation made no sense. She knew she hadn't gone down to the basement in days. So how was that possible? Taking a deep breath, he took a few hesitant steps towards the door. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. On the floor, mud marks stood out against the clean floor of the corridor. They were footprints. Large, misaligned, with shapes that seemed indecisive, as if something had gone with difficulty or without coordination. The marks came directly from the basement, forming a trail that stretched down the hallway. The mud was still fresh, trickling down in small ruts that glistened in the dim light. She felt an intense shiver run through her body, rising from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. The cup trembled in his hands, almost slipping from his fingers. "Who's there?" His voice sounded low, almost a whisper, but charged with tension and dread. She waited. The silence that followed was more deafening than any answer. There were no sounds of footsteps, no voices, nothing but the distant sound of rain against the windows. His breathing was ragged now, and the weight of fear seemed to bend his knees. With a trembling hand, she took another step, ignoring the urge to run away. He pushed the basement door hard until it closed with a crack that echoed through the house. He locked it quickly, turning the key until it was secure. He did it so hard that his fingers hurt. Only then did he take a step back, trying to catch his breath. But the footprints were still there, visible and as palpable as the fear that tightened in his chest. They were a relentless reminder that something, or someone, was inside your home. Something that shouldn't be there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating, as her eyes remained fixed on the mud trail. One question screamed in his mind, growing with intensity. What had come out of the basement? Walking upstairs with a cup of hot chocolate in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just the tension of the moment, but something almost visceral, a foreboding I couldn't ignore. The air around him seemed heavier, almost oppressive, making it difficult even to breathe. Even indoors, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows with an unusual intensity, as if trying to force its way in. But there was something beyond the weather, beyond the biting sound of the wind. It was silence. A silence that was not just the absence of noise, but something deeper, something that seemed to observe. Silence was never something that bothered her. In fact, she even liked him, especially at night. But at that moment, the silence seemed different, charged, almost tangible. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something she didn't yet understand. The feeling of being watched grew, squeezing her chest. Every step he took echoed exaggeratedly through the walls, like an amplified whisper that seemed to mock his attempt at normalcy. When she reached the top of the stairs, she stopped. An icy shiver ran through her body, up her spine and making the hairs on the back of her neck bristle. It wasn't just the cold of the environment, it was something more. His fingers trembled around the cup, and before he could compose himself, it slipped out of his hands. The sound of pottery crashing against the floor resounded through the hallway like a gunshot, breaking the oppressive silence for an instant. But as quickly as it came, the silence returned, swallowing the sound as if it had never existed. He bent down slowly, his muscles tense, to pick up the shards scattered on the floor. His fingers trembled, making the task difficult. As he collected the pieces of the cup, he tried to control his breathing, which came in short, quick pants. "I'm just tired." "That's it," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself. But as she leaned over to clear the floor, something captured her attention. A movement. A slight flutter in the corner of his eye, so subtle that he almost thought he had imagined it. He raised his head slowly, as if afraid to confirm what he had seen, while his heart hammered violently in his chest. He looked down the dark hallway, and then into the room next door. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized she wasn't alone. There, in the dim light of the room, something was still. It was a shadow, but not the shadow of a piece of furniture or any object that belonged to the house. No, that was something different. She was tall, motionless, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. His instinct screamed to turn on the light, but his fingers froze in place. Something in that presence seemed to warn her, "Don't do this." It was as if the darkness around her had come to life, pulsing gently, filling the space between her and the figure with a palpable tension. Before he could react, a flash of lightning cut through the sky outside, illuminating the room for a fleeting instant. In that brief flash of light, she saw more than she would have liked. It was a human figure, but the contours were wrong, disproportionate, as if something had distorted the form. It wasn't just a shadow. It was him. Her husband. Her mind went into shock, trying to process what she saw. He shouldn't be there. There was no way he could be there. She felt her knees weaken, and her eyes widened. Fear paralyzed every fiber of her body, as if she were frozen in time. Another flash of lightning lit up the space, and this time she was sure. It was him. But at the same time, it wasn't. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His features were familiar, but there was something about his face, something about the way he stood still, the way he watched her. It was not human. It could not be human. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out of her throat. Fear suffocated her, preventing any reaction. Before he could even try to move, he rushed forward, fast and relentless, stepping out of the dim light like a predator. The race was instinctive. She climbed the stairs, stumbling on the steps as she heard his footsteps close behind. The sound was erratic, as if he was limping or deliberately dragging his feet to add to his agony. It wasn't a natural sound, and every knock on the floor echoed like a warning that she wouldn't have much time. Reaching the top, he turned for a moment and saw his silhouette in the dark. He didn't seem tired or exhausted by the chase. He looked like a predator, with eyes that glowed in the darkness like an animal's. The hallway seemed narrower as she ran toward the bedroom. However, he was faster. In an almost impossible move, he reached her before he could close the door. The impact knocked her down, and she felt his weight on her body. The hands he once knew so well were now claws, squeezing his neck with a force that drew air out of his lungs. She tried to resist, but he was stronger, more agile. The force he exerted on her was inhuman, as if his intention was not only to hurt her, but to erase her completely. His face was close to hers, and even in the dim light, she could see his eyes. They were not the eyes of the man she loved. They were dark, empty holes, with a glow that seemed to pulsate as if something was inhabiting that body. In a desperate move, she managed to lift her knee and hit his stomach. The blow was enough to make him stagger backwards, letting her go for a brief moment. Seizing the opportunity, she got up and ran towards the kitchen. His bare feet slipped on the ground as he searched for something, anything that he could use to defend himself. Her eyes found the sharpest knife she possessed, and she gripped it firmly. He felt the weight of the blade in his hand and turned to face him. He was already there, standing at the entrance to the kitchen, with that blank stare fixed on her. He didn't hesitate, charging towards her as if the blow from before had meant nothing. She screamed and thrust the knife into his stomach. The sound of the blade cutting through the flesh was drowned out by her panting. But what happened next made his heart stop. He didn't scream, he didn't react like a human being. He just looked at the knife, pulled it back with terrifying calm, and threw it to the ground. Panic consumed her as he approached again. He was no longer the man she knew. It was not human. The air felt heavier and heavier as she retreated, her bare feet slipping on the cold kitchen floor. His every step resounded like a hammer pounding against the ground, rhythmic and relentless. There was no rush in his movements, just an almost animal-like determination. It was as if her fear was fuel for that thing that used her husband's body. She was cornered. The knife, which moments before had stuck in his stomach, was lying on the ground, out of reach. His eyes scanned the kitchen for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. But the options were limited. Everything seemed small and useless in the face of that monstrous figure that approached, slow and confident. "Please stop," he shouted, his voice trembling with fear and despair. But the one who stared at her did not react. There was no recognition in his eyes. There was no compassion, no anger. Just a deep emptiness, as if she were facing something that didn't belong to this world. Desperate, she grabbed a plate from the counter and threw it with all her strength. The object shattered on his chest, scattering shards on the floor, but he didn't even hesitate. He kept moving forward, his steps slow and deliberate. The noise of the crushed pieces of porcelain under his feet seemed to echo through the kitchen. With her heart pounding in her chest, she ran to the other side of the kitchen and opened a drawer. The metal utensils clinked as his hands trembled. He grabbed the first object he could find, a fork. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. When he got close enough, she lashed out, driving the fork into his shoulder with all her might. The impact made the thing hesitate for a moment, a guttural sound escaping from his throat. It was not a cry of pain. It was something deeper, almost vibrant, as if it came from a place she couldn't understand. Hesitation gave him enough time to escape. She ran into the living room, her feet slipping on the shards of glass and porcelain, her heart racing. But he knew that wasn't enough. I couldn't just run away. He would keep coming. Always. Understand. 7. The knife, the fork, and the survival instinct. The living room looked even darker than before, lit only by the lightning that streaked across the sky. She could barely breathe, each inhale bringing more terror than relief. She knew he was after her, even without looking back. I felt his presence, the oppressive weight of something that was no longer human. She tripped over a side table, almost falling, but managed to lean on the couch. I needed to think. I needed to find something I could use. The fork he was holding was still in his hands, but he knew that it wouldn't be enough to stop him. I needed something stronger, something definitive. She looked around, desperate. There was a pair of scissors on top of a pile of papers. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. He ran up to her and grabbed her firmly, feeling the weight of the metal in his hands. She turned around in time to see him standing at the entrance of the room. He looked bigger, more menacing in the dim light. The lightning flashed up his face for a brief moment, revealing an expression that didn't seem natural. His eyes shone like small embers, and the smile that now formed on his lips was cruel. "Why?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this?" He did not answer. There were no words, just a low sound, a noise that seemed to come from the back of his throat. That was the only answer she would receive. When he advanced, she reacted instinctively. The scissors cut through the air, hitting his arm. But once again, he seemed indifferent to the pain. He staggered back for a moment, enough for her to pick up a chair and throw it at him. The impact made a deafening noise, but he did not fall. He just stopped, as if he were evaluating the next move. She knew she didn't have much time. I needed to get out of there, but where? The answer did not come. The living room looked even darker than before, lit only by the lightning that streaked across the sky. She could barely breathe, each inhale bringing more terror than relief. She knew he was after her, even without looking back. I felt his presence, the oppressive weight of something that was no longer human. She tripped over a side table, almost falling, but managed to lean on the couch. I needed to think. I needed to find something I could use. The fork he was holding was still in his hands, but he knew that it wouldn't be enough to stop him. I needed something stronger, something definitive. She looked around, desperate. There was a pair of scissors on top of a pile of papers. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. He ran up to her and grabbed her firmly, feeling the weight of the metal in his hands. She turned around in time to see him standing at the entrance of the room. He looked bigger, more menacing in the dim light. The lightning flashed up his face for a brief moment, revealing an expression that didn't seem natural. His eyes shone like small embers, and the smile that now formed on his lips was cruel. "Why?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this?" He did not answer. There were no words, just a low sound, a noise that seemed to come from the back of his throat. That was the only answer she would receive. When he advanced, she reacted instinctively. The scissors cut through the air, hitting his arm. But once again, he seemed indifferent to the pain. He staggered back for a moment, enough for her to pick up a chair and throw it at him. The impact made a deafening noise, but he did not fall. He just stopped, as if he were evaluating the next move. She knew she didn't have much time. I needed to get out of there, but where? The answer did not come. Desperately running into the hallway, she climbed the stairs as fast as she could. The sound of his own footsteps mingled with the echo of heavy breaths and the rumble of thunder outside. His feet slid on the slippery floor, now wet from the rain that was beginning to come in through the open windows. Every drop that fell seemed to amplify the chaos around her, as if even the house conspired against her. Each step seemed more difficult, as if something invisible was draining his strength, making his movements slower, heavier. When he finally reached the top floor, despair took over. There was nowhere to go. The hallway seemed to stretch indefinitely, but all the doors she considered could be a refuge were closed, locked, or simply inaccessible. The bathroom was his only option. Without thinking, he ran to the door, entered and closed it with a bang, locking it with trembling hands. He leaned his body against her, desperately trying to block what he knew was coming. The heart hammered so hard that it seemed to echo through the small space. Outside, his footsteps were clear, resounding through the hallway with a calm that was even more terrifying. Every step felt deliberate, controlled, as if he knew exactly where she was and how the game would end. He was savoring that moment. The first knock against the door was deafening, an impact that made the wood vibrate and drew a shrill scream from it. But even as she screamed, she knew no one would hear her. There was no one around, just her and him. And he was trying to get in. It wouldn't be long. Looking around in desperation, he looked for something, anything, that he could use as a weapon. A razor, a broken piece of ceramic from the sink, anything that could give him a chance. But his eyes could only find everyday objects, a piece of soap, a towel, a toothbrush. Everything was so mundane, so useless in the face of the threat that was on the other side of the door. It was then that he heard a different sound, something that made his stomach turn in pure terror. It was no longer just the raw impact of knocking on the door. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic sound, something cutting through the wood. For a moment, she didn't want to believe it, but reality imposed itself like a cold blade. He was using an axe. The blows were firm and methodical, each tearing through the wood a little more. The first crack appeared, scattering splinters across the ground like shrapnel. She stepped back, pressing her back against the wall, her heart beating wildly. I tried to think, to plan, but panic dominated everything. The second blow opened a small hole, enough for her to see something on the other side. Her eyes froze when they met his. He was there, looking directly at her. Her eyes shone with a disturbing, almost animalistic intensity, But what terrified her most was the smile on her face. A wide, cruel smile that seemed to promise that the worst was yet to come. Each next blow made the hole grow, while the sound of the axe mingled with the echoes of the storm outside. She knew she had only seconds, maybe less. The only certainty she had was that if he walked through that door, there would be no escape. The blows against the door continued, stronger and stronger, more and more precise. The wood was in tatters, and the axe blade was already going through small holes, almost hitting his face in one of the blows. The bathroom, which had once looked like a refuge, was now a death trap. She was cornered. For a moment, everything stopped. The sound ceased, and the only thing that filled the space was his panting and the sound of rain falling outside. Whatever was on the other side of the door had stopped knocking. She felt a thread of hope. Was he gone? He bent down slowly, trying to see under the door. And there he was, standing, motionless as a statue. His bare feet were covered in mud, and small drops of what looked like blood flowed on the floor. But he didn't move. He was just there, as if he were waiting. Then he lowered his head, looking directly at her through the crack. His eyes were not normal. They were not human. There was something about them, something that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. They were black spheres, but deep down there was a red glow, like embers lit in an oven. That look was pure hatred, but it also carried something else: satisfaction. He was feeding on her fear, growing with every second she remained paralyzed. "You're not him," she whispered, the words coming out shaky. "What are you?" The answer came in the form of a smile. Not a human smile, but something twisted, inhuman. Her lips parted, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp to belong to anyone. He raised the axe once more and, with a single blow, made a hole large enough to pass his arm. She screamed and retreated to the opposite wall, holding a piece of pottery she had found on the floor. His arm went through the door, but she noticed something strange. The blood that flowed from the open wound didn't look like blood. It was dark, almost black, and had a thick, oil-like texture. With the hole large enough, he finally pushed his face in. The dim light of the bathroom illuminated his features in a way that made everything even more terrifying. There was no doubt. This was not the man she had loved. Something was using his body as a disguise, like an empty shell to move around. The revelation almost broke her. But at the same time, it awakened in her something that had been hidden until then, a fierce determination to survive. As he continued to make his way into the bathroom, memories began to invade her. They were quick flashes, like scenes from a movie that she preferred to forget. 3 days ago, she had buried her husband's body in the backyard. He was dead, of that she was sure. He remembered the weight of his body, the effort to dig the grave, and the sound of the earth hitting the makeshift coffin. It had all begun on that fateful night. She and her husband had had a terrible argument. He looked different, distant, as if something was already taking over him. During the fight, something got out of control. He couldn't remember the details clearly, but he knew there was blood. A lot of blood. After the incident, it went into automatic mode. He cleaned the scene, put the body in the trunk of the car, and drove to the backyard of the house. It was a rainy night, and the sound of the shovel against the soaked earth still echoed in his mind. When she finished, she stood in front of the grave for several minutes, her body shivering with cold and guilt. But one thing was certain: he was dead. Now he was there, or at least his body was. But something else had come back with it. Something that shouldn't be in this world. "You're not real," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You're dead. I killed you." He finally entered the bathroom, breaking the rest of the door with the axe. Now he was completely in front of her, the ghoulish smile still on his lips. He raised the axe slowly, as if he wanted her to see every detail of the movement. But before she could pull off the final blow, she acted. Using all the strength she had left, she plunged the piece of pottery into his face, right into his left eye. The sound was grotesque, and he finally screamed, a sound that was a mixture of pain and anger. He staggered backwards, knocking down part of the already destroyed wall. Seizing the moment, she ran out of the bathroom and down the stairs as fast as she could. He knew that wouldn't stop him, but he needed time. Time to think, to find a way to end it once and for all. When he reached the kitchen, He picked up the knife again and turned to face him. He came after her, even with his face bloodied and partially destroyed. But this time, she wasn't running away anymore. This time, she was ready to fight. And so ends the first part of this scary story full of mysteries. But is this really the end? What is behind this inhuman presence that took her husband's body? Will she be able to escape, or is the darkness surrounding her home just the beginning of something even darker? If you've gotten caught up in this narrative and want to find out what happens next, you already know what to do. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves a good horror story. What's more, if this video performs well, lots of likes, comments, and views, I promise to bring you part 2 of this terrifying story. There's a lot to explore, and you won't want to miss the dark secrets that are still buried in her backyard. So, if you want the sequel, show your support and comment below. I want part 2, Element. Your participation makes all the difference. See you in the next video. If you dare.